But before we look at the motives for lying on such a vast scale, let's look at where some NASA scientists came from. Peenemünde, Nazi Germany. For centuries, warmongering nations had been using primitive rockets as a weapon of war. China, Britain, and of course Hitler's Third Reich all used rockets to terrorize their enemies. Werner von Braun was an SS officer and rocket scientist. His team at Peenemünde designed the first cruise missile, the V-1 Doodlebug.
Come on!
The V-2 rocket was the forerunner to the Saturn V rocket, which would supposedly take man to the moon. At the end of World War II, the American government were desperate to get hold of the Nazi rocket weapons, which had wrought havoc on the innocent people of Britain. The American government launched Project Paperclip, which secretly changed the war criminal files on Werner von Braun and his colleagues. Files which described these SS officers as an ardent Nazi were changed to read not an ardent Nazi. Werner von Braun, his team, and the rocket factory at Peenemünde, which had terrorized Western Europe, was transported to the USA, lock, stock, and barrel. It soon became clear that the Nazis had a secret space program at Peenemünde and Nordhausen. The Hannibal craft utilized alternative propulsion systems such as vril power, possibly back-engineered from recovered crashed flying saucers. Prescott Bush was the grandfather of today's George W. Bush. Whilst working with the Bank of America and the Jewish Warburg brothers in Wall Street, Prescott Bush helped arrange vast loans to the Third Reich. The Third Reich's space scientists used Jewish prisoners as slaves to build gigantic underground bases and manufacture the V-2 rocket, which would terrorize Europe during 1944 and 1945. At Nordhausen and other sites in Germany and Austria, Werner von Braun and his team of Nazi SS engineers built vast laboratories and rocket factories. The interior of an entire mountain was excavated to accommodate a secret space facility which was no less than 1 million square feet. It was here, at Nordhausen, in top-secret underground bases, that a huge number of experimental rocket ships and circular flying discs were developed. The prototype V-7 craft was powered by engines manufactured by BMW. The V-7 used 12 BMW 028 engines, which were powered with helium. radical fuselage shapes were developed, which would later lead to the emergence of stealth aircraft and the cruise missile. These unidentified flying objects inspired the development of Nazi flying discs. After World War II, the underground base at Nordhausen was rebuilt in the Mojave Desert, a place we now know as Area 51.
A tremendous sighting took place, and I'm just completely baffled right now. So is Mr. Anthony Hilder.
Example of one of the many objects seen regularly in Las Vegas. Very bright object, just basically hovering over Las Vegas, 5:30 p.m. Cylindrical object, a craft. We believe it could be some kind of an observation platform.
So what you had then was this CIA, British intelligence operation called Project Paperclip, which was to get the Nazis, the major Nazis, with all and a lot that with tremendous knowledge that are not registered by history, out of Germany so they would be safe, and into South America and North America to continue this agenda up to the present day. And so this is why you have Nazi after Nazi turning up as founders of and creators of NASA and all these other institutions, the CIA, that appeared immediately after the Second World War.
To begin pressurization of the fuel tank, the second stage fuel tank pressurized, third stage fuel tank pressurized, the countdown continuing to move along smoothly, T-minus 90 seconds. Now looking at the liquid hydrogen tanks as they become pressurized, LH2 aboard the second stage, pressure 17. Final guidance release, we'll expect engine ignition at 8.9 seconds.
In 2003, the skeptical magazine Fortean Times claimed that no such craft or Nazi secret space program had ever existed. But we have been given patents from leading German manufacturing companies, including Juha, Krups and BMW, which prove beyond all reasonable doubt that Hitler considered the Nazi secret space program a top priority. And more than 15 billion Deutschmarks were spent developing craft of all shapes and sizes. Secret memos from SS officers reveal that Werner von Braun and Hitler both believed that there were alien civilizations in the universe, and it was their intention to not only conquer all nations on planet Earth, but to also colonize the moon.
Gentlemen, the conquest of outer space is the greatest technological challenge of the age in which we live. The first decisive step in the conquest of space will be the placing of an object into an orbit wherein it will indefinitely circle the Earth.
1954. Sputnik 1 shocks the world and puts the USSR way ahead in the Cold War. Sputnik 2 takes a dog into space, the first living creature to leave the face of planet Earth. Russia then shocks the world by sending an unmanned probe to the moon. Meanwhile, the US Army plan Project Horizon, a plan to colonize the moon with Americans. This plan was soon abandoned when the true nature of the hostile environment of outer space was discovered by American and Russian scientists. (1958). Spectacular rocket failures destroy American morale. The Explorer 1 space probe confirms planet Earth is surrounded by dangerous radiation. Radiation so powerful that it could cause nausea and cancer. The Van Allen radiation belts and solar particles from the Sun are extremely hazardous to humans. Space is also full of micrometeorites which can rip through spacesuits and metal in the blink of an eye. Meanwhile, Russia celebrate getting the first man into space, Mr. Yuri Gagarin.
There was already a parallel space program, and it had been continuing from even before the time that NASA was created in 1958. October 1958, NASA were incorporated by President Eisenhower. The secret space program was run by the Department of Defense. It took its original form in Project Horizon, which was established in 1959, the habitation of the colonization of the moon. The reason for that was that whoever controlled the moon controlled the Earth. If you could launch rockets from the moon onto your enemies on Earth, they couldn't possibly retaliate, therefore you had the upper hand. There was a serious attempt, certainly a serious investigation, to put man on the moon and keep him there. So the secret parallel space program continues to this day. There is a military space shuttle, and even the ones that we see from Columbia onwards are designed according to the specification of the Department of Defense. If you look at them, they will carry spy satellites into orbit. And if you want to know what a spy satellite looks like, the Hubble telescope is one. That is the design of what's called the KH-12, the keyhole satellites, which are used today over enemy territory, which is presumably any territory that is not American.
Regardless of the dangers of radiation, and without having spacesuits nor spacecraft which can protect the occupants from radiation, NASA convinced the American people to pay $40 billion for the space program.
The most lethal forms of radiation, of course, are at the higher end of the spectrum. That's gamma rays and X-rays. We know what ultraviolet can do. If you stay out too long in the sun, you get sunburn and skin cancer and die, and it's all very sad. But gamma rays, and X-rays especially, are particularly lethal to humans, unprotected humans. There was no protection that I have been able to identify. I've found no reference to it. I found nothing that will tell me what level of protection is offered, so I have to assume none was. I've contacted the manufacturers of the spacesuits, and they said there was no radiation protection built into the spacesuits, because I asked them if these same spacesuits could be used by technicians to go to Chernobyl or 3 Mile Island, because the nuclear reactors produce the same radiation as produced in space. They said no, not advisable, no protection.
Ex-Nazis were now in charge of vast amounts of tax dollars. In today's value, the Nazis at the heart of the NASA space program were given more than $600 billion. All NASA had to do was announce a new space project, and the money was handed over so that the American government could save face in the Cold War. Alan Shepard and John Glenn were blasted into space using equipment which was still in the prototype stage. John Glenn reports UFOs to Mission Control, which he describes as looking like fireflies, similar to the Foo Fighters reported by pilots during World War II.
It's very difficult to know if the politicians know the real truth or not. We know that there is government inside the government. We know that there is military intelligence. We know that in America, after the Manhattan Project was created, that group subsists. And that group was the one who handled the Roswell crash, the Socorro crash, and others.
Are you talking about Majestic 12?
Yeah, probably it's a different name now. Now it's not Majestic 12, now it's something else.
I am here to discuss the so-called flying saucers. The Air Force interest in this problem has been due to our feeling of an obligation to identify and analyze to the best of our ability anything in the air that may have the possibility of threat or menace to the United States. In pursuit of this obligation, since 1947,
clear the launching area.
NASA spent gigantic sums of money during the 1960s, but most of it was spent on the ground, not in space. Huge American corporations, many of which were manufacturing hardware for the military, made gigantic profits designing space vehicles and, more importantly, life-sized models of spaceships, and even huge stage sets resembling the lunar surface. Someone in NASA had realized that after taking billions of dollars from the American people, if they couldn't make it to the moon, they would fake it to the moon.
Obviously, if you're going to somewhere that nobody has been before, you need to have a simulator which recreates that environment as closely as you can. If you're going to the moon, you recreate the surface of the moon. And here we see a section of the lunar surface created. It's about 30 foot high, 30 foot long, 35 foot long. scale is given by the two people standing in front of it. There were plenty of simulation exercises, but the point is, and should be taken into account in virtually everything that is discussed with the Apollo program, 400,000 people may have worked on the program in total, but none of them had a need to know more than his own job required. The people who were making the rockets didn't know what the people who were making the spacesuits were doing, because they had no need to know about that. Their job was to make the best models and the best simulation of the lunar surface that they could. And if we come up to this picture here, we see the three scales on which these models were built. We have here the whole moon as one unit. It stands about 20 foot high. We have here behind it a section of the surface of the moon. You'll notice it's curved. And here we have a more detailed section of the lunar surface.
What you're saying is that the images which we're told show a camera pointing out the window of the lunar module as it's coming into land on the moon could well have been filmed previously using these large-scale models.
That's right. It could well be that what we are looking at are films of realistic models. We have no means of knowing if they were actually taken on the lunar surface, or whether what we're watching is part of the simulation exercise and the training exercise. And you'll notice here on these models there is a camera track. A camera starting at this end, coming down here, would approach the moon, or appear to approach the moon, and become ever closer towards it. It's exactly what you would expect to see if you were flying to the moon. This is a simulation rig that was built. This is the command and service module of the Apollo program. And you'll notice that the window here looks out onto a block here. And there's another one here. They're curved. These are the screens onto which the lunar surface was projected as the craft made a simulated approach towards the lunar surface.
Is what we're seeing a mixture of fact and fiction?
It is fact, it is fiction. It's mixed together. It's hard to separate them until you examine it closely. If a spacecraft is in deep space, the only possible explanation for a light seen through the window of the spacecraft is the sun. It's the only bright light in space. If it's not the sun, then it has to be some other artificial light, which implies that that particular image is possibly fiction.
July 1961. NASA was soon being criticized for the flimsy construction of their hardware. The first orbital capsules did not even have windows in them for the astronauts to look out of. One of the most vocal critics was one of NASA's most respected astronauts, an all-American hero named Virgil Gus Grissom, who almost drowned when recovery helicopters were unable to lift his space capsule from the sea. After a successful journey into space, Gus Grissom almost died through NASA's bad planning. Or was this an early attempt to silence Gus Grissom? May 1963. Astronaut Gordon Cooper experiences re-entry problems in his Faith 7 rocket ship.
7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Roger, have liftoff and the clock is operating. Start your clock. Take my 7, base 7 on the way.
The prototype lunar module, known as the LIM, had serious stability problems. At this stage, there was no guarantee that even if NASA managed to get a spaceship orbiting the moon, they could land safely without killing the crew. Could the footage which we see of the limb approaching the moon be filmed in a TV studio?
It was filmed in a TV studio. There's absolutely no doubts whatsoever about that. And the way that this film was created was by the use of models. There's nothing secret about the models. They exist. You can go and see them today. The models were very lifelike, very realistic. There is one that is a life-size model. It's in Flagstaff in Arizona. It's 2 miles long, and it's an exact replica of the Sea of Tranquility. The photographs were used to create from those images the replica of the Sea of Tranquility, so that if it was flown over in a helicopter, it would appear as if it was a spacecraft approaching a similar area to land. So yes, all the scenes of the lunar surface were filmed on Earth.
June 1965. Gemini 4 is launched and the first man walks in space.
I'm going to drag it a little bit so I don't want to fire the gun yet. Okay, I'm out. Okay, now, open.
Extensive rehearsals at docking spacecraft were performed in low Earth orbit. Everything was recorded on film. This footage would later become invaluable as NASA sought to fake the success of the Apollo missions. Meanwhile, more problems occurred. On Gemini 9, the second spacewalk had to be cut short due to problems with the astronauts' oxygen supply. On Gemini 11, another attempt to walk in space was curtailed due to fatigue. Was this a sign that cosmic radiation caused nausea and fatigue? NASA could not risk the public humiliation of having brave astronauts crashing to their deaths on the lunar surface broadcast on live TV. NASA's Nazis knew that a major catastrophic failure on the moon would cause the billions of dollars of funding to be immediately cut. Anyone with the most elementary grasp of science could tell that the Saturn V rockets were merely big versions of the Nazis' V-2 killing machines. Regardless of whether the Apollo moon landing was faked or not, an interesting photograph hangs on the wall of the Sanctuary of the Scottish Rite Masons in Washington, D.C. This photograph shows astronaut Neil Armstrong holding a Masonic apron over his spacesuit. The photograph has seemingly been taken on the moon, or at least on a studio set which resembles the surface of the moon. Neil Armstrong has become a mysterious character since his alleged moon expedition. According to the records of the Ohio Grand Lodge of Masons, Neil Armstrong's father is a Freemason. In fact, Neil Armstrong Sr. is a high-ranking 33rd degree Freemason. Neil Armstrong's co-pilot, the second man to have allegedly walked on the moon, was Buzz Aldrin. At the time of the Apollo 11 mission, Buzz Aldrin was a 32 degree Freemason. They were in good company, as many of NASA's astronauts were also Freemasons, including Gordon Cooper, Walter Schirra, John Glenn, Edgar Mitchell, Thomas Stafford, and Paul Weitz. These men were all members of the Brotherhood, all sworn to keep secrets on pain of death. These astronaut Masons were under the leadership of Kenneth Kleineknecht, who was NASA's Apollo space program manager. According to an article and photograph published in the Masonic magazine Scottish Rite Journal, upon his return from the moon, Brother Buzz Aldrin presented a flag to Sovereign Grand Commander Smith, who was the Supreme Commander of the Supreme Council of 33rd degree Masons of the world. The flag Buzz Aldrin presented had been taken to the moon on Apollo 11. According to a Masonic lecture delivered at Beauverde University in 1994 by American Masonic historians, astronauts Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong performed a Masonic ritual exactly 33 minutes after touchdown on the lunar surface. They temporarily planted the international flag of Scottish Rite Freemasonry, which features a large double-headed eagle. Therefore, the eagle has landed.
Override off. Engine arm off. 13 is in. We copy you down, Eagle. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot. And we're getting a picture on the TV.
The short Masonic ritual Armstrong and Aldrin allegedly performed declared the celestial body of the moon to be the property of the Masonic God. Who is the Masonic God? As confirmed by former Supreme Commander of the 33rd degree and Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, Albert Pike, the Masonic God is Lucifer. The name of NASA's space program, Apollo, according to the Holy Bible, is actually an alternative word for the devil. We can see this in the Bible as the word Apollyon. Apollyon appears as the name of Satan in the original texts of the New Testament Gospels. Like Christopher Columbus and many explorers before them, Armstrong and Aldrin used a flag to claim territory for their monarch. Upon their return, NASA Space Program Manager Kenneth Kleineknecht invited the Apollo crew to a secret Masonic ceremony, which saw Kleineknecht's brother be appointed to the Sovereign Grand Commander and titular head of all Scottish Rite Masons throughout the world. Once you learn the occult significance of words such as Apollo, Columbia, and Atlantis, you will realize that the occultically inspired murdering Nazis who developed NASA's space program have used names which are part of ritual, magic, and the occult.
Howard G. Intel.
Well, I'm just kind of curious whether I would land on the blue or the brown part of the Earth.
On the dark side of the moon, the secret face of our satellite planet, which only a few men in living history have ever seen, there lies a star-shaped crater called Parsons Crater, named after the rocket scientist John Parsons. John Parsons is known by several names. He was born under the name Marvel Whiteside Parsons and soon became involved in the occult. Charles Taze Russell, who invented the Jehovah's Witness movement in America, predicted that the beginning of the end of the world would commence on October 2nd, 1914. On this very day, rocket scientist John Parsons, better known in occult circles as Jack Parsons, was born. A brilliant rocket engineer, Parsons soon entered into correspondence with SS Nazi officer Werner von Braun, and by the age of 13 had begun summoning evil spirits and demons using magical rituals which Parsons had learnt from British occultist Aleister Crowley. Aleister Crowley styled himself as the Beast, and Jack Parsons referred to Aleister Crowley as his father. Grand Master of the Priory de Sion, Jules Verne, had written several books which strongly influenced the mind of the young Jack Parsons. In 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Jules Verne prophesied the invention of a submarine vehicle which could wage war from the depths of the oceans. In newspaper reports read by the young Jack Parsons, he saw German U-boats launching futuristic torpedoes, travelling under the sea and causing death and chaos. Young Jack Parsons wrote in his journal that if the French author Jules Verne's submarine was a tangible possibility, then why not the rocket ship which travelled to the moon and back in Verne's other books? For most of Jack Parsons' adult years, he was an adept of occultism and a distant disciple of Aleister Crowley. When Crowley visited California and gave the go-ahead to form a new chapter of his OTO Satanic Secret Society, it was Pasadena, the hometown of Parsons, which was chosen. Jack Parsons developed and patented several liquid and solid fuel rocket engines. His patented designs are still being used to this day on intercontinental ballistic missiles such as Polaris and the Space Shuttle. The Polaris nuclear missiles use Parsons rocket technology, which has a pentagram-shaped void impressed into the solid rocket fuel to aid faster burning. Parsons also patented an acid aniline mix, which was used on the first generation of Titan nuclear missiles, used to deliver deadly warheads and also used for high-level atmospheric tests. Coincidentally, Jack Parsons' occult mentor, the British beast Aleister Crowley, used to often call himself the nickname Titan. On April the 15th, 1942, Parsons demonstrated a plane powered by two liquid fuel rocket boosters at Edwards Air Force Base. The test was witnessed by Alfred Ledding, who fronted the US military's Project Sign, which investigated UFOs and helped cover up the phenomenon for decades. Jack Parsons revered the English Satanist Aleister Crowley, and eventually became the leader of one of Crowley's secret cults called the OTO. The OTO, or Ordo Templi Orientalis, claims descent from the Bavarian Illuminati, which had been revived by Adam Spartacus Weishaupt on May 1st, 1776, and had approximately 2,000 members in Masonic lodges in London, Paris, Copenhagen, Amsterdam, Munich and Ingolstadt. The Illuminati was essentially controlled by European, Germanic, Jewish aristocrats, who sought to replace the church, government system and national identity of nations with an Illuminati-controlled superstate. The Illuminati was eventually outlawed in Europe, and the founders fled to America. They then fragmented their maverick secret society into fraternities operating from the campuses of Yale, Harvard, and Princeton. From his pulpit in Brooklyn, New York, charlatan priest Charles Taze Russell prophesied that from October 2nd, 1914, the beginning of the end of humanity would commence, with the emergence of the Antichrist and Babylon the Great, as foretold in the Bible's Book of Revelation. Jack Parsons, born on that prophetic day, would later attempt to invoke the incarnation of Babylon and also sign an oath stating that he was indeed the Antichrist. Alternative propulsion systems such as Vril power, possibly back-engineered from recovered crashed flying saucers. Prescott Bush was the grandfather of today's George W. Bush. Whilst working with the Bank of America and the Jewish Warburg brothers in Wall Street, Prescott Bush helped arrange vast loans to the Third Reich. The Third Reich's space scientists used Jewish prisoners as slaves to build gigantic underground bases and manufacture the V-2 rocket, which would terrorize Europe during 1944 and 1945. At Nordhausen and other sites in Germany and Austria, Werner von Braun and his team of Nazi SS engineers built vast laboratories and rocket factories. The interior of an entire mountain was excavated to accommodate a secret space facility which was no less than 1 million square feet. It was here, at Nordhausen, in top-secret underground bases, that a huge number of experimental rocket ships and circular flying discs were developed. The prototype V-7 craft was powered by engines manufactured by BMW. The V-7 used 12 BMW 028 engines, which were powered with helium. Radical fuselage shapes were developed, which would later lead to the emergence of stealth aircraft and the cruise missile. But before we look at the motives for lying on such a vast scale, let's look at where some NASA scientists came from. Peenemünde, Nazi Germany. For centuries, warmongering nations had been using primitive rockets as a weapon of war. China, Britain, and of course Hitler's Third Reich all used rockets to terrorize their enemies. Werner von Braun was an SS officer and rocket scientist. His team at Peenemünde designed the first cruise missile, the V-1 Doodlebug.
Come on!
These unidentified flying objects inspired the development of Nazi flying discs. After World War II, the underground base at Nordhausen was rebuilt in the Mojave Desert, a place we now know as Area 51.
A tremendous sighting took place, and I'm just completely baffled right now. So is Mr. Anthony Hilder.
Example of one of the many objects seen regularly in Las Vegas. Very bright object, just basically hovering over Las Vegas. 5:30 p.m. Cylindrical object, a craft. We believe it could be some kind of an observation platform.
So what you have...
The V-2 rocket was the forerunner to the Saturn V rocket, which would supposedly take man to the moon. At the end of World War II, the American government were desperate to get hold of the Nazi rocket weapons, which had wrought havoc on the innocent people of Britain. The American government launched Project Paperclip, which secretly changed the war criminal files on Werner von Braun and his colleagues. Files which described these SS officers as an ardent Nazi were changed to read "not an ardent Nazi." Werner von Braun, his team, and the rocket factory at Peenemünde, which had terrorized Western Europe, was transported to the USA, lock, stock, and barrel. It soon became clear that the Nazis had a secret space program at Peenemünde and Nordhausen. The Hannibal craft utilized alternative